What's going on, guys? Welcome to E3 Athletics. This is going to be Nutrition 101. What we're going to do today is go through a presentation that I made up for a nutrition class that I used to teach at a prior facility that I'm now tailoring for us. So, a lot of great content. The first one is going to be just Nutrition 101, the very basics. And before we get started, I want you guys to know that this doesn't replace the information of a medical doctor, doesn't replace the information from a dietitian. This is just general, basic, overall nutritional information that I think you guys will find really helpful, especially if you don't understand how things like proteins, carbs, and fats work. So let's go ahead and get the computer screen up and get going. Boom. Okay, just kidding. So we have, and I apologize, I'm going to be talking to you guys on the screen, but I've also got the presentation up on my screen as well. So go ahead and get this slideshow started and go from there. Let's see here. Alright, so Nutrition 101, okay, I've already detailed and explained that this is going to be very, very basic information. I'm not giving you any sort of meal plan, I'm not giving any of that. This is just basic information, general education on nutrition so that you have a better idea. Also keep in mind that while this is very basic information, it doesn't get into the real advanced stuff. So for anyone who says, well, that's not quite right if I explain something, know that I'm just giving a very broad, basic overview, and that as this series continues on, we'll get into more depth as far as some of the topics are concerned. So it was just a real basic overview for Nutrition 101. Alright, so let's start with how calories work. So one of the things that I hear a lot of the times and that kind of confuses me is that a lot of people seem to think that calories are these little things that are just floating around in our bodies or that our body actually consumes or uses. A calorie is actually just a measure of energy. So unlike it says in the corner here, where calories are tiny creatures that live in your closet and sew your clothes a little bit tighter every night, they really are just a measurement of energy. So the energy needed to raise the temperature of 1 gram of water by 1 degree Celsius, or as we use in the States here, we use kilocalories, and so that is the amount of energy needed to raise the temperature of 1 kilogram of water 1 degree Celsius. And that's typically what you would find on food. So even though it says calories, in the United States we measure things based on kilocalories. So that's all a calorie is, just a measure of energy expended, okay? So we'll get into a little bit more depth as to what that means for some of the other stuff here in just a few. So how calories work, okay? So calories come from 3 different main areas that we consume, and the first one is going to be protein, the second being carbohydrates, and the third being fats. And so these calories are not all created equally, and we're going to get into what they are and what the process our body goes through to absorb them and what they're used for here in just a little bit. But what I want to touch on is the fact that proteins, carbs, and fats don't have the same caloric values as each other. So what that means is while 1 gram of protein and 1 gram of carbohydrates is equal to 1 calorie or 1 kilocalorie here in the United States, the fat content that you see is worth 9 kilocalories or 9 calories. For the rest of the video, I'm just going to say calories. So one thing that people also don't understand is that 1 gram of pure alcohol, and so obviously it's very hard to find pure alcohol, right? But 1 gram of pure alcohol is 7 calories, and these calories aren't used for the body for anything other than they end up just going to fat storage. So those are our 3 basics. You've got proteins, carbs, and fats, okay? So there's a whole broad spectrum outside of that, or I shouldn't say outside of that, but explanations of each. They get a little bit more complicated, so let's kind of jump into that. So carbohydrates, 101 here. Carbs are, basically there are 2 types of carbs, okay? And carbohydrates are either simple or they're complex. There's a whole other idea or system out there of their glucose content and how they're broken down by the body, but we're not going to get into that because that gets kind of confusing, where sometimes simple carbs have a a higher index level than complex carbs. It just gets kind of confusing. So for the simplicity of this video, we're going to concentrate on just the fact that there are simple and complex carbs. So simple carbs are broken down and utilized by the body very quickly, and these things are stuff like sugar is probably the most basic prime example of that. And then the other one that people don't realize is refined carbohydrates. Things like bread, pasta, and whole wheat products are typically processed by the body very similarly to the way that sugar is, because they are not largely complex carbohydrates. Okay, so when we talk about carbs, simple carbs are absorbed very quickly and tend to be part of the problem when we talk about gaining fat tissue, because what your body does with those is, instead of being able to utilize it all immediately or overloading your pancreas, which is what releases insulin, it ends up just getting stored as fat a lot of the time. So in general, complex carbs are going to be a better choice generally for you than simple carbs. So things like complex carbs, they break down much more slowly. You can see in the actual slide here, you've got a glucose molecule, and then you've got a complex carb. So a glucose or fructose or anything sort of sugar, fruits, refined sugars, that stuff, those all break down immediately into glucose in the system. Whereas with a complex carb, your body has to break the connections between the molecules down before it can absorb into the body. Now, don't get me mistaken, complex carbs do eventually end up as glucose in our bloodstream. It just takes the body longer to do that, and you end up with a more even keel when we're talking about nutrient release. So, the whole saying of, give a kid a bunch of candy, they get really hyper and then they crash. That's why. So your body ends up releasing a ton of insulin to deal with all that sugar. You get this burst of energy, and then you end up crashing because insulin then absorbs all of the glucose into your system, and you end up with a real tired feeling, which is not good for the pancreas, it's not good for the body. So again, complex carbs are going to be broken down slower, and things that include complex carbs are oatmeal, sweet potatoes, vegetables. Those are just kind of some ideas behind what are complex carbs. So the question is, carbs are bad, or are they? So our body still needs carbs. Your body actually uses carbohydrates as fuel. That's the main use of carbohydrates. If you overeat carbohydrates, your body will store it as body fat. But you want to make sure that you're ingesting enough carbs based on the activity level that you're doing. Because if you don't have enough carbohydrates, or if your body doesn't have enough fuel, one of the things that it will do is it'll break down your lean muscle tissue to be used as energy before it starts to go to your fats. So that's just one of the things you want to keep in mind, is you don't want to completely undereat on the carbohydrates, but you don't want to overeat on them as well. So it's, everything in moderation. So, and again, as it says here on the slide, every excess carbs that cannot be immediately used or stored by the liver will be converted to body fat within a certain amount of time, depending on your metabolism, your body's need for carbs at that point. So carbs, not necessarily a bad thing. We just want to make sure that we do everything in moderation for that. So moving on, what's the story with fats? So this is one that people get confused a lot. So let's talk about the differences between fats first. So there are good fats and there are bad fats, and that's a little bit of a misnomer in and of itself, but again, this is really basic education. So you can kind of think of saturated fats as your bad fats. They're the ones that are going to contribute to your higher cholesterol levels a little bit easier, and they're the ones that just tend to clog us up a little bit more. Now, your body still has a need for saturated fats, but super refined fats, super refined anything is definitely not going to be as good for the body. The good fats, the basic explanation of good fats is that they come in unsaturated fat, and you have both poly and monounsaturated. So let's talk about what the body actually uses fat tissues for. I'm sorry, not fat tissues, but the fat that you are ingesting through. So yes, of course, fats can be used and stored by the body as body fat. We know that. But what they're actually used for and utilized for is, on some level, a little bit of energy, and then on the biggest level, though, we're talking about hormone production. So insulin for men, you're talking about that testosterone production. For women, you're talking about that estrogen. Your whole endocrine system, or your whole hormone system, is based on the use of fats. It also transports vitamins and minerals through our body. So there are some some vitamins that are only soluble in fat, so A, D, E, and K, which are very, obviously we all need a good balance of vitamins and minerals in our systems, but these particular vitamins can only be transported or stored within fat tissue in the body. So the other thing, and the most important thing that they do aside from all that, is insulating the heart, the organs, the vital organs, the liver, all of that. So we all have a predisposed amount of fat in between our organs and cells to provide some cushion and protection for our bodies. So that's why it becomes unhealthy at a certain point to be below certain body fat percentages, because at that point you're actually, there's nothing left to take from the body, and so it starts taking body fat from inside of you, and that's when it becomes dangerous for your health. So remembering that fats are also 9 calories instead of 4, you don't need to eat as high of a volume of them to get the same amount of nutrients or the same amount of energy or the same amount of hormone production. So we want to definitely keep the fats a little bit lower. We wouldn't want to eat, say, let's take in typical, like my diet, I typically ingest somewhere between 200 to 250 grams of protein per day. I would not want to ingest that much fat because there's just really no need for it. The human body can function and produce adequate amounts of insulin, of all the other hormones at a much lower level. So typically a lot of healthy diets somewhere in that 30 to 60 grams per day range, although 60 is probably a little bit high. We can talk about things like the South Beach, the Atkins, the ketogenic diets that rely on a higher content of fat to replace some of the carbs that you're not eating. But that's a topic for another day. So healthy source of fats, we're talking about nuts are typically a good source of fat. So you've got your peanuts, your almonds, those are all really great sources. You're going to want to watch portion sizes though, because a portion or a serving of peanuts is a very small amount. So it's, basically will fit just barely in the cup of your hand versus taking handful after handful after handful. So things like peanut butter, as unprocessed as possible, so one that doesn't have a ton of sugar added to it, can be really good. Avocados, olive oil. Most fish is going to have really healthy fats for you. Coconut oil, and then if you don't have a sensitivity to it, a lot of dairy products actually have some decent fats. As I said before, refined fats, so anything that says partially hydrogenated oil, or preservatives, vegetable oils, those kinds of things right there are going to be the unhealthy fats that we want to avoid as much as possible. So, all right, here's the big one. So protein. So proteins are the building blocks of our lean muscle, of our lean tissue cells. And so what people don't realize about protein is an overall term for a group of smaller individual things called amino acids. And so our body relies on a certain number of amino acids to be able to create full proteins, in which they use to repair lean tissue cells. A lot of people say, and I hate when I see this on commercials, but they'll advertise like a protein bar, for instance. This protein bar gives me so much energy because of all the protein in it. Protein does not provide energy per se for your body. It does help you recover. It does help rebuild lean tissue. If you're working out, exercising super hard, you're breaking down that muscle in the gym, protein, these amino acids that the proteins get broken down into, end up being what repairs that muscle. The reason that people say that they get a ton of energy from things like protein bars or whatnot is because of the high amount of carbs that these bars and these really, really good tasting shakes have. So just be really careful. Things that say that they're high in protein that taste really, really good tend to be really high in either carbs or fats, because protein by itself, if you've ever had a really low carb, really low fat protein shake before, it's always got that kind of weird protein-y taste. So protein by itself kind of tastes a little bit funny, especially after it's been processed. So protein is not stored in most cases. There are some special circumstances and whatnot. Protein is not typically stored as body fat. The problem with that is, I hear a lot of times, well, you can overeat on protein all you want because your body doesn't store it. And that's true, your body doesn't store it. But what ends up happening is you end up with liver toxicity because of all the extra protein that your body's trying to process. And so, yes, your body does expel it, it does get rid of it, but what ends up happening is you're damaging your liver, you're damaging the body's cleansing systems in the process. So you definitely don't want to overeat protein. You want to eat roughly, if you're on a good nutrition program, a good fitness program, if you're working out and breaking down your muscles and your cells, most people want to shoot for about 1 gram of protein per pound of lean body tissue. So right now I'm at about 212 pounds, but my body fat's about 10%. Okay, so my actual body, my lean tissue, is somewhere closer to about 185 to 190. So I wouldn't want to necessarily be eating up towards that high of a range, especially since I'm dieting right now. That's a topic for another time, though. I don't want to eat to my actual body weight. So I'll use an extreme example. Say that unfortunately you're overweight, you're weighing right around 300 pounds, and your body fat's in the 50% range. I've worked with people like this before. You would not want to eat 300 grams of protein. You would want to eat what your actual lean tissue is. So you would want to figure out what your body fat percentage is, and then take that and find out what your lean body mass is. And so someone who's at 50% body fat at 300 pounds probably only be somewhere between 150 to 175 grams of protein. As they start to gain muscle and lose body fat, that number may go up, but we definitely don't want to over-consume protein. There'll be more videos in the future that kind of explain the trickiness of protein later. Like I said, this is just a real basic overview of what we're looking at. So some of the great sources for protein, your meats, so your beef, your fish, your chicken, your pork, those are all going to be great sources of protein. You just have to be careful because things like beef and pork and some cuts of fish tend to be a little bit higher in the fat. So if you're trying to lose weight, you're trying to diet, you got to be careful that you include the amount of fats that you're getting from those into your diet and not overeating on them. So other great sources of protein are things like eggs, and I get the argument a lot of times that you only want to eat egg whites. The fats that you find inside of the yolk are actually good fat for you, and so I wouldn't say that they're a bad thing. It just makes your fat content go up. So basically what that means is egg whites are definitely going to be lower in the fat content, but there's also a good source of protein within the yolk as well as your good fats. So egg whites or just whole eggs, going to be a great choice. Nuts do have a fairly high source of protein for not having been something that I call a being. So it wasn't an animal before, it was a plant. So for plant-based, seed-based, nut-based protein, it's actually pretty good, but just remember again, it's going to be really high in that fat content. So for the vegetarians or just anybody who enjoys it, soy is a great source of protein as well. And then things like beans, so your black beans are going to be a great source of protein. And then of course you've got your protein supplements, but you just want to make sure that these are low in carbs, low in sugar. Not just low in carbs, but make sure that, if it's got 10 grams of carbs, it's not all sugar, because at that point you may as well just go eat, go grab a milkshake. And then you want to make sure that it's low in fat as well. So I want to touch a little bit on the topic of dairy, and we're going to talk about this in a later video as well. But dairy is one that if you look at the content of it, things like Greek yogurt, milk, they all seemingly have a really high protein content. Here's the problem with that. A lot of the time, and I know it's on the list, but a lot of the time we've got, especially in the US, everything's required to be pasteurized. And when a liquid goes through a pasteurization process, which is basically just using steam to heat it up to a certain temperature for X amount of time based on the volume and then bringing it right back down, a lot of times this can damage the protein and the amino acid blends in these items. And so what ends up happening is your body can't absorb that protein quite as well. So we'll touch on that a little bit more in a later video. You can always leave comments below if you have some questions on that. But for the most part, milk and dairy products tend to not have as high of an absorption rate on protein as the nutrition label would lead you to believe. So That's about it for this one. Like I said, this is a real basic overview. If you guys have any questions, please feel free to email me. You can contact me at matt@e3athletics.com. You can always leave a message through the website at www.e3athletics.com. You can leave your comments below with any questions that you might have. I hope this video was a little bit of a knowledge boost for you and provided some great information. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe for more content. Thanks, guys. Have a good night.